The regulars at Miller's Range had a nickname for the old bolt-action rifle Dana Whitfield carried in on the first Saturday of every month. They called it the museum piece. It was scratched along the barrel, the bluing worn thin in places, and the wooden stock had gone smooth and pale from decades of handling. Next to the sleek, modern rifles lined up along the counter, with their carbon fiber stocks and glowing red dot scopes, Dana's rifle looked like something that belonged behind glass in an exhibit, not out on a firing line getting used. Dana never argued with the jokes. She was 61 years old, quiet by nature, and she moved with the slow, careful economy of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion cost more than it ever saved. 22 years in the Army had taught her that lesson, and it had never left her. She had served 2 tours as a combat medic, patching up soldiers in places most people only ever saw on the news, and before that, she had earned a marksmanship badge at just 19 years old, back when most of the young men now snickering behind her hadn't even been born. She kept to herself most mornings at the range. She would sign in at the front desk, nod once to whoever was working the counter, and walk straight to lane 6, the same lane she always used, as if it had been reserved for her by some unspoken agreement with the universe. She would lay her gear out in the same order every time. Ear protection first, then eye protection, then the rifle case, unzipped slowly, almost with reverence. People who had watched her enough times knew not to interrupt this part. It was less a routine and more a kind of quiet ceremony, the way some people might light a candle or say a small prayer before starting their day. That particular Saturday, a group of younger shooters had been at the range for almost an hour already, loud and confident, dressed head to toe in the latest tactical gear. They had matching range bags, expensive optics, and the easy swagger of people who had grown up on video games and internet gun channels before they ever grew up around a real one. They were not bad people. They were just young, and young people sometimes mistake noise for knowledge. One of them, a wiry man in his mid-20s named Cole, had been watching Dana from a few lanes over for several minutes. He nudged his friend beside him and nodded toward her rifle case. "Is that thing even safe to shoot?" he said, not quite trying to keep his voice down. "Looks like it's older than my dad." His friends laughed. Dana heard every word. She always did. Hearing loss was one of the small costs of a career spent around gunfire, but somehow, she still caught every joke made at her expense, as if her ears had learned to filter out the noise and keep only the words that mattered. She said nothing. She finished loading her magazine, set it down beside the rifle, and continued exactly as she had 100 times before. But Cole was not finished. Emboldened by the laughter of his friends, he walked a little closer, leaning against the divider between lanes with the kind of casual disrespect that comes from never having been told no. "Ma'am, no offense," he said, "but that thing looks like it belongs in a war museum. You sure it still shoots straight?" The range went quiet in the way it does when everyone nearby stops what they are doing to listen without looking like they are listening. Dana turned her head slowly and looked at him. It was not an angry look. It was something calmer and, in its own way, more unsettling. It was the look of someone who had been underestimated so many times in her life that it no longer had the power to sting, only the power to amuse her. "Set up 10 targets," she said. "Give me 8 minutes." Cole blinked, clearly not expecting a direct challenge. His friends, sensing entertainment, immediately perked up, pulling out their phones. The range officer that day was a retired Marine named Hollis, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, who had known Dana for nearly a decade. He had seen her shoot more times than he could count, and he did not bother to hide the small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth as he walked over. "You heard the lady," Hollis said, waving the younger group back toward the safety line. 10 targets, staggered distances, 50 out to 200 yards, standard start position, rifle on the bench, hands off until the buzzer. He glanced at Dana. "You want the shot timer?" "Please," she said simply. The younger shooters exchanged looks, half amused, half suddenly unsure of themselves. Most of them had never shot anything at 200 yards without a scope powerful enough to read a newspaper from that distance. Dana's rifle had nothing but simple iron sights, the same kind used by soldiers generations before any of them were born. Hollis and another range worker moved quickly, setting up steel targets at staggered distances across the range. Some were close, easy 50-yard shots that even a beginner might manage. Others sat much farther out, small silhouettes against the dirt berm, requiring real precision and real patience. By the time the targets were set, a small crowd had gathered along the safety line, drawn by the unmistakable smell of an unexpected show. Dana stepped up to the bench. She did not rush. She settled into position with the same unhurried calm she brought to everything, adjusting her stance, resting her elbows just so, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder, the way another person might feel the weight of a favorite coat on a cold day. "Ready?" Hollis asked. "Ready," she said. The buzzer sounded. There was nothing flashy about what happened next. No wasted movement, no hesitation between shots. She raised the rifle, found her first target, breathed once, and fired. The bolt cycled in her hand almost before the echo of the first shot had faded, smooth and practiced. The kind of motion that only comes from thousands of repetitions performed so many times that the body no longer needs the mind's permission to move. The first steel target rang out its metallic clang, and a small ripple went through the crowd. She moved to the second target without pause, adjusting her aim, breathing, firing, clang. The bolt cycled again. Third target, clang. She did not look up at the crowd. She did not smile or acknowledge the growing murmur behind her. Her whole world in that moment had narrowed down to breath, sight picture, and trigger. The same three things that had kept her alive, and kept the soldiers under her care alive, through 2 deployments in places where a wasted second could mean the difference between a life saved and a life lost. By the fourth target, the phones that had come out half in mockery were now recording in earnest. Cole had stopped smirking. He stood at the safety line with his mouth slightly open, watching a woman he had mocked less than 10 minutes earlier work through targets with a rhythm that looked less like shooting and more like breathing. Fifth target, sixth. The rifle's report and the answering clang of steel had settled into a kind of music, a call and response that silenced even the last of the whispered jokes. By the seventh target, nobody in the small crowd was talking at all. They simply watched, transfixed, as the woman with the museum-piece rifle worked her way down the line with a precision that made the expensive optics on the younger shooters' rifles suddenly seem almost beside the point. Eighth target, ninth. Dana's breathing had not changed. Her hands had not shaken. If anything, she seemed to be moving slightly faster now, not out of urgency, but because her body had fully settled into the old rhythm, the one carved into her by a mentor sergeant more than 40 years ago, and polished smooth by decades of practice since. She dropped the 10th target with 6 minutes and 40 seconds showing on the timer. For a moment, nobody moved. The range, which had been full of noise and laughter less than 10 minutes earlier, was completely silent except for the fading echo of the last shot rolling off the berm. Then, almost as if given permission, the small crowd erupted. Someone let out a low whistle. Someone else started clapping, and within seconds, the applause had spread down the line, even among shooters who had never spoken a word to Dana before that day. She set the rifle down gently on the bench, the same careful reverence with which she had lifted it out of its case, and pulled off her ear protection. Cole was the first to approach her, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to awe. He held his phone loosely at his side, the recording still running, forgotten in his hand. "How?" he started, then stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "How did you do that? With iron sights? At 200 yards? Dana looked at him for a moment, not unkindly. There was no triumph in her expression, no desire to make him feel small, the way he had tried to make her feel small, less than half an hour earlier. There was only the quiet patience of a teacher who had spent much of her adult life training soldiers far younger and far more frightened than the man standing in front of her now. "Muscle memory doesn't care how old the gun is," she said, "or how old I am." She told him, and by then the small crowd that had drifted closer, about the rifle's history. It had been a gift from a mentor sergeant named Ruiz, who had drilled the fundamentals into her when she was barely out of basic training, back when she had been nothing more than a scared 19-year-old who did not yet know if she had what it took to serve. Ruiz had been patient with her, in a way few people had been before, correcting her stance, her breathing, her grip, over and over, day after day, until the motions stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like an extension of her own body. Those same fundamentals had carried her through 2 deployments overseas. As a combat medic, she had spent long, exhausting days treating wounded soldiers under difficult conditions, often with far too little sleep, and far too much fear pressing down on her chest. The discipline she had learned on the range, the ability to control her breathing and steady her hands under pressure, had served her just as well in a field hospital as it ever had on a firing line. Steadiness, she explained, was steadiness no matter where you needed it. She had carried that discipline home with her when her service ended, and she had never quite let it go. The rifle had become a kind of anchor for her, a physical reminder of who she had been and who she still was underneath the quiet, unassuming exterior most people saw. Once a month, on the first Saturday, she came to Miller's Range not to prove anything to anyone, but to keep a private promise to herself. A promise that skill built slowly, over years of patient practice, does not disappear just because the world stops paying attention to it. By the time she finished packing up her gear, the same young shooters who had been laughing at her rifle an hour earlier were gathered around her, asking questions about breathing technique, about trigger control, about how to hold steady when your hands wanted to shake from nerves or excitement. Cole, notebook app open on his phone, listened more intently than he had listened to anything in a long time, nodding along as she explained the small, unglamorous details that had taken her decades to master. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier," he told her quietly, once the others had drifted off to try out some of what she had taught them. "That wasn't fair of me." Dana offered him a small, understanding smile. "You didn't know," she said. "Most people don't until they see it for themselves. That's all right, now you know." Cole's video, posted that same evening, with the simple caption "She just humbled all of us," spread further than he ever expected. Within a week, it had been viewed more than 2 million times, shared by people who had never picked up a rifle in their lives, and by veterans who saw something familiar and moving in the steady, unhurried way Dana had carried herself through every single shot. Most of the comments were not about her score, impressive as it was. They were about the calm. People wrote about how rare it was to see someone move through a difficult task without a trace of panic or hurry, how her stillness seemed to say more about strength than any loud declaration ever could. Dana never watched the video. Someone mentioned it to her the following month, showing her the view count on a phone screen, and she simply nodded politely and changed the subject. It was not that she did not care. It was that the video, the applause, the sudden attention, none of it had ever been the point for her. The point had always been the quiet Saturday morning ritual itself, the unzipping of the case, the familiar weight of the rifle, the 10 targets waiting patiently to be met with the same discipline she had carried with her since she was 19 years old. She was back at Miller's Range the next month, same time, same worn rifle resting in its familiar case, same quiet nod to Hollis as she signed in at the front desk. She walked to lane 6 without a word, laid out her gear in the same careful order as always, and began. No one called it a joke again.